Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AEMO Quarterly Energy Dynamics Report for Q4 2025. My name is Franca Tamaris, the Events Coordinator at the Melbourne Energy Institute. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that today we are gathered on the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders past and present. Some housekeeping rules before we start. All questions must be submitted through the Q&A option on the menu, as a chat function is disabled. We'll have some time for questions during the session and at the end, and we'll endeavour to get through as many questions as possible. I would like to welcome our presenter today, Kerry Galloway, Manager Market Insights at the Australian Energy Market Operator. Kerry leads a team responsible for the Quarterly Energy Dynamics Report, a key publication from AEMO. With 20 years of experience in the energy industry, she has worked in various areas of the wholesale and retail gas and electricity markets, including demand forecasting, network planning and connections, and market reform delivery. Kerry holds a Bachelor of Engineering in Mechanical and a Bachelor of Science in Applied Mathematics from Monash University. Today's moderator is Dr. Dominic Davis, Lecturer in Power Generation and Transport in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Melbourne. His research focuses on understanding and addressing the technical, economic and practical constraints that shape our energy systems. Thank you again for joining us, and I will now hand over to Kerry.
Thank you, Franca. Thank you for having me here today to discuss the Quarterly Energy Dynamics for our QED report for Q4 2025, which covered October, November and December. As people know, the Quarterly Energy Dynamics provides a very detailed overview of the quarterly outcomes for all the markets that AEMO operates. But today I'll be just going over the National Electricity Market, or the NEM, and the East Coast Gas outcomes. So I will start with the National Electricity Markets and start by looking at the underlying demand. Now, the underlying demand is effectively the end-use demand. So it reflects the sum of the operational demand or the grid demand, so that's the demand that is served by the grid, as well as the demand met by consumer energy resources such as rooftop PV. So we're continuing to see a trend in growth in underlying demand, with this up by 2.2% year on year, reaching a new Q4 high. And this was really driven by few factors: warmer conditions in the northern regions, which increased cooling demands, alongside cooler conditions in the southern regions, which lifted heating demand in those regions, as well as ongoing growth in electrification, data centre growth and population-driven growth. So this increase in underlying demand was partially offset by continued growth in distributed PV output, which is really evident during the day, as shown on this chart on the top right. So the average rooftop PV output also reached a new Q4 high. It was up nearly 9% from Q4 last year. And as a result, the operational or grid demand increased only slightly, up about 1% year on year. And if we look at the regional breakdown on the bottom right here, we can see that the underlying demand, so that's a bit in the grey, increased in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, so in all mainland regions. We've in fact new Q4 records, high demands in Queensland and South Australia. But operational demand only increased in Queensland, Victoria and South Australia, with New South Wales actually falling to a new Q4 low, and that was due to that strong PV output in that region. Now I'll move on to the maximum and minimum operational demand outcomes. So with that higher underlying demand, we saw increased evening peaks. So maximum demand was higher in most regions, whereas the rooftop PV output also reduces the daytime operational demand. So we saw minimum demands in all regions as well. So Queensland was the only region to have a new Q4 maximum demand, which happened on 22nd of December, but all NEM regions had new Q4 minimum operational demands, with Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania, and the NEM as a whole having record low minimum operational demands. And South Australia stood out with its minimum demand reaching negative 263 megawatts, with distributed PV output supplying 117% at the underlying demand during that half-hour interval of the record. Okay, I'm just going to move to the NEM wholesale price outcomes now. So the average NEM wholesale prices dropped sharply in Q4 2025. So prices averaged $50 per megawatt hour, which was 44% lower than Q4 2024. And on the right-hand side, you can see this chart breaks it down into energy and cap components, and both components fell across every NEM region. And there were two main drivers behind this result. So the first was we had reduced price volatility. So the cap returns, or what we call the cap returns, which is a contribution of prices over $300 per megawatt hour, fell from $86 per megawatt hour in Q4 2024 down to just $13 this quarter. Now, that was really more a reflection of what happened back in Q4 2024, where we had quite an unseasonably early heat wave impacting New South Wales and Queensland, which caused high demand, which coincided with some coal generator and transmission outages and really pushed some price volatility in that period with quite strong reliance on higher price sources of generation, such as gas and hydro. But in this quarter, we saw much stronger wind and battery discharge, particularly in those evening peaks, and better coal availability too overall. And so during the evening peaks, that increased wind and battery output did reduce the need for higher priced gas and hydro generation. And secondly, just overall renewable output put downward pressure on prices. So combined renewables and storage output reached a record 51% share, and this uplift lowered both average spot prices as well as reducing the incidence of high-priced intervals. So as a result, the energy component of prices, so that's the average of the prices capped at $300 per megawatt hour, fell to $47 per megawatt hour from $71 in the previous year. Okay, so I'm just going to look here a little bit more at rooftop PV and its impact. So we know the impacts on the operational demand shape with that duck curve and continuing new minimum operational demand shapes. But with rooftop PV now being such a major supply source, we can also see sudden output changes impacting price volatility. So I'm just going to start looking at the scale of the rooftop PV growth over the last 5 years or so, and we can see strong and steady growth in rooftop solar capacity over that period, with total installations rising from 2.3 million to 3.7 million by the end of 2025. And over the same period, the solar capacity grew from 12 gigawatts to 25 gigawatts. And we can just see on the bottom left chart how that growth in installed capacity has translated into higher output, with that output really continuing to grow in those daylight hours. And then the charts on the right show a couple of days that we had where rapid changes in PV output really shaped demand and contributed to price volatility in New South Wales. So on 26th of November, we did have sudden cloud cover moving in with a severe thunderstorm at around 11 a.m. And that caused drops of over 1,000 megawatts in rooftop solar output in 2 consecutive 30-minute intervals, to have over close to 2,200 megawatts reduction in rooftop solar in just an hour. And that's kind of equivalent to losing 3 Eraring units of the coal units in that period. So it's quite a substantial drop. Prices did spike to the market price cap at 11 a.m. for 4 dispatch intervals, and then there were some oscillations after that as the market kind of adjusted. And then on the 19th of December, it was actually quite a hot day. So we had temperatures up around 40 -2 degrees in parts of Sydney. And again, the rooftop solar output dropped off quite quickly in the afternoon with cloud cover moving in. It was less extreme than on the 26th of November, but we still had a drop of around 700 megawatts around 2 p.m. And prices did reach $14,000 per megawatt hour for 3 dispatch intervals. And just moving to look at sort of more average price setting dynamics across the quarter. So what we've seen is a large increase in how often the wind, grid-scale solar and batteries all set prices compared to last year, and then also subsequent decreases in the other, in hydro, black coal and brown coal. Hydro had the most notable reduction in price setting frequency, but it is still the most frequent price setting technology across the NEM. In terms of prices set when these technologies are marginal, most fuel types did set lower prices than last year. In particular, you can see the battery discharge reducing from $309 per megawatt hour down to $119 per megawatt hour. And this just reflects that overall fall in wholesale spot prices and the reduced volatility across the market that we saw in this quarter, particularly when compared to quarter four 2025. Quarter four 2024. Okay. So now I'm going to look at the overall generation outcomes. So total NEM generation did increase by 3.1% year on year, reflecting that higher underlying demand I mentioned, as well as more battery charging during the day. So here on the left-hand side, we can see the year-on-year changes in average fuel type. And on the right, we have those same changes, but shown on a time of day basis. And then the corresponding fuel mix changes at the bottom. So what we can really see here is that the increase in generation come from wind, solar, which is both grid scale and rooftop, along with the battery discharge, whilst all the other fuel types declined. Wind generation saw the strongest growth. It increased across all hours of the day on average, and in the evening peak we saw higher wind and that sharp uplift in battery discharge, with the two of those displacing gas and hydro in those periods. And then during the middle of the day we had the higher wind and obviously the stronger solar output, and that reduced the need for black coal and gas generation in those daylight hours. And as a result of this increased renewable and storage output, the renewable energy share, including storage, which exceeded 50% for the first time, reaching 51% this quarter. And in fact, even if we exclude storage, so battery discharge and pumped hydro output, the primary renewables still reached a new high at just over 50% this quarter. Okay, so I'm just going to delve a little bit into the sort of individual fuel types. So coal-fired generation did decrease to a new all-time low this quarter, with this decline driven by New South Wales units where we had lower availability and also reduced utilisation. Queensland units partially offset this decline with higher availability supporting stronger output compared to last year. And then in Victoria, brown coal generation also reached a new low. What's probably notable is how coal is now operating with the time of day output for the different regions shown on the right-hand chart. So in New South Wales in particular, we really see that lower generation across all hours, but especially during the daylight hours with that really increased intraday variability of operation. And we did even notice Bayswater Unit 2 on 3 occasions this quarter, 2 shifting. So effectively, turning off during the daylight hours and then returning for the evening peak. And that's something we've only seen very rarely in the past. So we're overall seeing in a little bit of a shift to some more price responsive behaviour. Okay, I'm going to look now at gas and hydro. We've both continuing to trend lower this quarter. So gas-fired generation fell to its lowest quarterly level in more than 2 decades, with declines in every region apart from New South Wales. The increase in New South Wales was partially due to continued commissioning at the new Hunter Power Station, and it's had its second unit beginning commissioning in December 2025. Elsewhere, particularly in Queensland and South Australia, gas generation fell sharply as renewables and storage really displaced the gas during both daytime and evening periods. And hydro generation also declined year on year, with the largest reductions in Victoria and New South Wales, whilst Tasmania was slightly higher. Okay. Moving on to wind and grid-scale solar, where the combined output reached a new record quarterly average, so continuing that strong growth trend we saw throughout 2025. Grid-scale solar set a new all-time high, led by increases in New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria, while South Australia did actually record a decline in grid-scale solar output. Wind generation was also very strong, marking this the second highest quarterly level on record, with both Queensland and Tasmania recording their highest ever quarterly output. So for both solar and wind, higher generation was really driven by new connections and projects progressing through commissioning, as shown on these charts on the bottom here. For wind, though, it wasn't just about capacity growth. We did have higher wind levels this quarter, which lifted available capacity factors across the NEM from 31% to 37%. And Tasmania had a strong increase in wind output, recording availability capacity factor at 49%. However, with that stronger availability, we also had a sharp increase in economic offloading, which did reach a new high in level. It's almost double the levels that we saw in Q4 2024, and all mainland regions actually recorded record high negative price occurrence this quarter. So grid scale solar offloading was most pronounced in New South Wales and Queensland, while wind offloading was the highest in Victoria, reflecting limited export capacity, including reduced flows on Basslink due to some changed bidding behaviour, which I will talk about later. So overall, the NEM-wide grid scale solar offloading represented 18% of the availability, and wind offloading represented 15% of availability. South Australia did have the highest economic offloading as a proportion of availability, and that reached 59%, really reflecting that region's very low daytime spot prices, as well as some limitations on energy transfers to Victoria. Okay, in this slide, I'm just going to look at the peak renewable contribution and the renewable contribution to meeting the daily maximum operational demand, which are two measures that we track in the QED. So the peak renewable generation reached 78.6, so that's the current record and the new high, and that was on 11th of October, which exceeded the previous record, which had just been set in September, of 77.2. And at the time of the record, distributed PV made up over half of the generation, with wind and grid-scale solar providing most of the remainder. Now, looking at the chart on the right, so this is a daily maximum demand period, and this typically occurs during the evening peak when the rooftop solar has rolled off. So here the average renewable share increased to 36.6, and that was driven mainly by that stronger wind output as well as some higher battery discharge. Okay. So I'll move to the storage now. So the total net revenue across the NEM grid scale battery fleet was quite similar to the year before at 70 million. However, the actual revenue mix did shift from the year before. So the energy arbitrage revenue increased to 61 million, where the revenue from the frequency control and ancillary service markets declined to 9 million. And that really reflected lower FCAS prices, and FCAS is now making up a share of only 13% of total battery revenue, down from 31% in Q4 2024. So battery capacity is continuing to expand rapidly. We had several large new projects entering commissioning over the past year, and they added around 3.8 gigawatts and 8.6 megawatt hours of capacity in the past year. So that means that the battery discharge increased almost threefold to 268 megawatts on average. However, the arbitrage revenue was significantly impacted by lower price spreads with that lower price volatility. So the NEM-wide price spread earned by batteries more than halved, falling from around $240 per megawatt hour in Q4 2024 to $104 per megawatt hour this quarter. So quite a drop there. Oh, sorry. Actually, we might pause here for Q&A now before I just move across to.
Thanks, Kerry. We don't have too many Q&A questions just yet, so please get your questions in at the Q&A at the bottom. Maybe I'll ask the first question as the moderator, Kerry. I'm really interested in that event you mentioned in New South Wales in November with the loss of more than 2 gigawatts of rooftop solar. Can you comment how well that event was forecasted, and then which resources came in to fill that gap? And then I think on the previous slide you had New South Wales as the only region with a significant cap content in the price. Was that just this event, or what? How much did this event contribute to that?
This event did actually contribute to the majority of that cap. There were
Right.
only 4 days where there was much volatility, and that was the 26th and the 19th, as
Right.
well as a couple of 25th as well and the 18th. So the drop in the rooftop PV was not actually forecast very well. Our rooftop PV forecasting at the moment, our production system is actually a 30-minute system, and this cloud cover did come in very quickly.
Right. Yeah, it
So,
looks like it.
so it did come. I think that the step up of generation was across multiple sources, including battery discharge at that time. And it was only really the 4 intervals where the price did spike to the price cap, and then it kind of went actually very low, negative. And
Right.
then sort of oscillated a bit as everyone kind of adjusted because it wasn't forecast. We do have a system in testing for a 5-minute forecasting for the rooftop solar. And there is some work doing now to see how well that model would have predicted this. So yeah, that's a work in progress there.
Right. But so this 2-hour event led to was it a $10 or $20 increase in the price for the quarter for New South Wales?
Yeah, sorry, off the top of my head, I can't. It might be more like $8 of that
Okay.
across the 4, but it was, yeah, it was a reasonable amount. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Interesting.
the way the market operates.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really can just be very small amount of times that can change the quarterly price.
Right. So we've got a few questions coming in. The first one on batteries. What is the impact of increasing number of batteries on the grid, on grid demand in the early afternoon? And can you comment on how this might change over the next few years?
I'm assuming we're talking about household batteries now under the scheme that has come
I think
in
so. Yes.
recently. Yeah. Look, we only in the QED, we just sort of talk about the number of batteries that have come in, which is quite significant, and the amount that's come in. I think we had was it 140,000 across the NEM states, and around 3,400 megawatt hours. So very significant. However, at this point, because that's all behind the meter, it's not that easy for us to forecast exactly what the impact on the operational demand is, particularly when we do have other impacts on the demand, such as we had quite an increase in heating demand in the mornings, which would probably be happening at the same time as the batteries are charging. And we also had a decrease in cooling demands in the afternoon because it wasn't as hot, which is when the batteries are discharging. So it's a little bit difficult on a gross level to separate those, but there is work going on internally to look more at a household basis, houses with batteries and without, and to try and quantify that better. So hoping we can have more in future QEDs, but there's a lot of work to be done to really model that. But we do expect it to grow as well. I mean, the rate that the batteries are growing, I think we say it's the amount of household batteries now is about 3 times bigger than the largest grid scale battery. So it's getting, very significant.
On underlying demand, you mentioned that one of the drivers was data centers. Does AEMO record and publish what percentage of demand is attributable to data centers? Will we see that in upcoming QED reports?
That is published in our forecasting reports, so more of an annual report rather than the quarterly reports. Yeah.
Okay. On Tasmanian hydro generation, do you have a reason for the increase in the last quarter?
So it's a year-on-year increase. A large part of it is due to it being quite low the year before.
Yeah.
It was the weather was very dry, so the reservoirs were relatively low last quarter, and there's been recovery in that rain, so the dam levels are higher, and we had more hydro generation in Tasmania.
Thanks. Is it correct to link the higher amount of time renewables and storage are setting the price directly to the lower wholesale prices in this quarter?
I mean, it's a factor. I don't think it's much more of a factor on the sort of average prices, or what we call the energy prices, the negative 300. The cap ones are very dependent on everything that happens with those events. So, we can still have lower energy prices with wind and grid scale solar setting prices more often. But if you have some very volatile events, the overall wholesale price might be higher even with that.
So a question on SA, recognizing that offloading in South Australia set records and the SA grid solar was down, can we expect for distributed PV gradually causing the wind and solar to be stranded assets? Is the rooftop solar eating the lunch of the grid scale?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a dynamic we're seeing there. I mean, I guess there is some quite substantial growth in both grid scale and definitely household batteries in South Australia. There's been large uptake in all states, but South Australia seems to be quickest on these things. So, that will hopefully help soak up some of that rooftop solar as well as and provide more operational demand.
On a related note on distributed resources, with the growth in home batteries, do we have any evidence of the uptake translating to greater virtual power plant participation?
Sorry, I'm not up to date on the numbers of virtual power plant participation. Okay. Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's great. Let's move on with the next part, and we can come to some more questions a bit later.
Cool. Just give me a minute to find. I know that my slides can delay a little bit, so hopefully I'm on the interconnector slide. So just was going to quickly look at interconnectors and FCAS and power system management before I move across to the East Coast gas outcomes. So our total transfers were around 6% lower than in Q4 2024, with this really driven by much lower flows between Victoria and Tasmania on the Basslink interconnector. And the charts on the right hopefully help explain a little bit what's happening with Basslink. The top one shows the average time of day flows, so we can see a large reduction in that green line this quarter compared to the purple this same quarter last year. And the bottom chart shows the Basslink transfer capacity offers in their price ranges. So Basslink does operate as a market network service provider at the moment, where it offers its transfer capacity between Victoria and Tasmania via market bids, where effectively higher price offers require larger price differentials between those regions for the flow to be scheduled. So before 1st of July 2025, Basslink capacity was all offered at very low prices, effectively $0 per megawatt hour. But since 1st of July, the price of Basslink transfer capacity has increased significantly, and as a result, the flows have fallen substantially in both directions. And in fact, Basslink spent almost half of dispatch intervals with no flow, up from just 7% in this same quarter a year ago. Other than that, the flows were relatively similar. We had higher flows between Queensland and New South Wales, particularly in stronger overnight transfers from Queensland to New South Wales. Between South Australia and Victoria, the flows were actually broadly similar on a sort of net basis or an overall basis, but we did see that exports out of South Australia were constrained in almost half of dispatch intervals during the daylight hours. And these constraints did contribute to increased economic offloading of grid-scale solar in South Australia, and the reduced flows on Basslink contributed to increased economic offloading, particularly of wind across those mainland regions. I'm going to look now at the frequency control and ancillary services, and as I noted on the battery revenue, FCAS prices were down. So the FCAS costs reduced to 18 million in Q4 2024, and that was down 70% from Q4 2024, with reductions recorded across all regions. There was the regulation and raised contingency services all decreased year on year. We did have some increase in the lower contingency services. So the lower 6-second service in Queensland had the highest increase, and it contributed to about 30% of the costs overall, with some planned outages impacting the Queensland to New South Wales interconnector in October and early November, which required local enablement and sort of increased the price of that service. If we look at the enablement, we see batteries just keep continuing to increase their volume share of the FCAS services up to 64%, with some new Victorian batteries, including Latrobe Valley BESS and the Melbourne Renewable Energy Hub, contributing strongly to this increase. We did see increased enablement at hydro and demand response unit, but decreases across the rest, with the largest decreases in the virtual power plant and the black coal units. So last thing I'm going to look at in the NEM is some of the power system management, where we did require directions in Q4 2024 to manage system strength, reserve, minimum system load, and we have this ongoing voltage control in South Australia. So these directions were driven by both high and low demand conditions, and also by a reduction in the number of synchronous units online. And that's kind of demonstrated a bit on the charts on the left here. So now these charts show there's been a decrease in the number of coal units online at the same time this quarter compared to a year ago. So for New South Wales, for example, there was no periods where we had 11 or 12 units online together at the same time, compared with around 17% of the quarter in Q4 2024. And the proportion of time that only 7 coal units were online increased from almost none to 5% of the time. And in Victoria, we see similar dynamics, with the proportion of time that 6 or fewer coal units online increasing from 5 to 15%, including almost 3 hours with only 4 units online, which I can't really see on the graph, but it is there. So this reduction in synchronous plant being online did lead to system strength directions at times in both New South Wales and Victoria. So in New South Wales, most of these occurred between the 28th and 31st of October, following a tube leak at Vales Point Unit 2. And then in Victoria, directions were required on the 15th of October when we had a tube leak at Loy Yang Unit 4, Unit 4. And again on the 16th of October, where 2 of the units at Yallourn tripped at the same time. Then we also needed reserve management actions. So there, reserve management is when we have high demand. So that was on the 18th and 19th of December, and the Waratah battery was directed to maintain high energy storage levels so that it would be ready to discharge in the event of even higher demand. And then in South Australia, we needed minimum system load directions on 6 days in total in November and December And so in that case, we direct Torrens Island and Blythe. They're effectively directed to maintain minimum state of charge levels, so they are ready to charge up if required and to increase the demand. And then voltage control in South Australia did rely much less on directions and more on the NSCAS, network support and control ancillary service contracts that we have in place with various gas generators in South Australia. But overall, we're having very low gas generation operation in response to market signals with those low prices and high renewable output. The amount of time and the sort of overall gas volumes we required to use for voltage control was actually broadly similar to Q4 2024. Okay, so I've finished up with the NEM now, and I'm just going to cover off some dynamics from the East Coast gas market. So continuing from Q3 2025, it was actually a relatively stable period in the East Coast gas markets in Q4, which led to fairly consistent prices. So the average East Coast wholesale gas prices was $12.68 per gigajoule for the quarter, which was just slightly higher than Q3 2025, but not a significant change. But they were 7% lower than Q4 2024. So some of the drivers for this decrease from Q4 2024 included the LNG export dynamics. So Queensland LNG export demand fell faster than the associated supply reduction. So we had an extra 2.3 petajoules being redirected into the domestic market. And this led to less reliance on Victorian supply to meet demand. And then much of this extra supply was offered into the market at prices lower than Q4 2024. And then we also had lower overall gas demand. So East Coast gas demand fell by 3% compared to Q4 2024, which is shown on the chart on the right, with that driven by the lower Queensland LNG export demand, which is down 10 petajoules, and quite reduced gas-fired generation demand, which was lower by 6 petajoules. And that was related to that gas-fired generation being the lowest in 25 years with that higher renewable supply. And this all put downward price pressure on spot prices across all AEMO markets, and particularly in the Brisbane short-term trading market. Now, the international prices, as represented on the left chart, by the ACCC netback price, that decreased from Q3 2025, with forward prices ranging from $11.83 to $13.61 gigajoules over the next 6 months. The key reasons for this price decline included a regional oversupply on LNG in Asia due to warmer temperatures across North Asia, and an increase to China's domestic gas production and higher flows from Russia into China. And there was also a decline in the Brent crude oil prices, which is another factor that impacts those prices. And just looking at the chart on the right again, so I mentioned the total demand decreased by 3% with those large decreases in Queensland LNG and gas-fired generation. We did have some increase in the AEMO markets demand, so that's the commercial and industrial residential, and that was pretty much all in Victoria, with cooler temperatures increasing heating load across the quarter. Okay, I'll just move to the next slide, looking a little bit at where the supply come from this quarter. So, I mentioned we did see an increase in supply into the domestic market from the Queensland LNG products. So this occurred despite the Queensland LNG production decreasing by 7.7 petajoules, but because the export demand decreased by 10 petajoules, there was an additional 2.3 petajoules of supply to the domestic market. And then with that, we can see on the chart on the right that the Victorian transfers to the other states decreased by 10.2 petajoules from the previous year due to lower Victorian production and higher southerly flows from Moomba on the Moomba to Sydney pipeline. And it was actually the 4th lowest Q4 for Victorian exports since 2008. And the key reason for this was some decreases at Longford Gas Plant, which was down 7.1 petajoules, and Otway, which was down 2.4. So I'll just look a little bit more at Longford in the next slide here. So Longford's production was its lowest Q4 since 2014. Now 2014 was impacted by commissioning of the Queensland LNG export projects, which saw large increases in supply into the domestic market during their commissioning phase. So it's a little bit of an unusual year. But this time, however, the reason for the lower production was a reduction in the Longford capacity factor, which was down to 84%, which was its lowest since 2019. And you can see this on the chart on the left with a solid red line compared to the 2025 maximum capacity line, which is in the purple dash. So this lower capacity factor is attributed to Esso and Woodside having a proportion of their Longford supply offers into the Victorian DWGM and Sydney STTM priced higher than the daily price outcomes in those markets. So in other words, they have more gas available, but prices have not yet, didn't climb to a level where the market's scheduled that gas. One of the few times where Longford's output matched its capacity was when capacity was reduced to around 200 terajoules a day for 10 days in December, and that was due to planned offshore maintenance. Then if we look at the Iona storage on the right, this did end Q4 2025 with 13.5 petajoules in storage, which is actually the lowest end to a year since 2021. So the factors that contributed to the slower Iona refill compared to sort of recent years was that cooler weather in October. So Iona was utilised to meet increased Victorian demand for heating requirements, as well as those major planned outages at Longford, and there was also an outage at Otway gas plant in December. I will just say, given we're in sort of not quite midway in February 2026, but Iona has been filling strongly at the first part of this year and is on target to be filled prior to winter, barring any unplanned supply interruptions or unexpected demand increases from gas-fired generation. But at the moment, it is filling quite strongly and is looking good for winter. Okay, that is the end of the formal presentation.
Thank you, Kerry. We've got a few more questions.
Excellent.
Perhaps let's go to transmission. You mentioned about Basslink changing its bidding behaviour. Can you comment on why that might be the case and whether that related to how Tasmania had high wholesale prices?
Yep. So Basslink, I can't remember the dates exactly. So APA, who own and operate Basslink, did put into the AER to be converted to a regulated asset, so the same as all the other interconnectors, with the plan of that originally being done from July 2025. And they did note that they'd had a long-term supply arrangement with Hydro Tasmania, which effectively meant that they did bid in at zero, and that contract was going to expire on the 1st of July 2025. So whilst we don't see the contract details, we can assume that that is what has happened. So they've had to move to commercial operation. As far as I know, they're still working to become regulated from now, July 2026. But I think we're still waiting on the final price determination from the AER and then the formal decision.
Right.
And yes, I mean, Tasmania's a little bit, even when Basslink is operating fully, we tend to see higher prices in Tasmania during the day because they don't have anywhere as much rooftop PV and they don't have any grid scale solar. So even when Basslink was running fully, it tended to get to its highest capacity and we would see price separation. So it does tend to sit up higher in the middle of the day. And yes, this reduced flows has contributed to that dynamic more so.
Another transmission line. Can you comment on Project Energy Connect, the status there, when we expect that to be in operation and whether that will provide a relief valve to renewable offloading in SA?
Oh gosh, I'm sorry, I don't know the actual current date. I know stage one is in, but that's only like 150 megawatts compared to the full
Yeah.
700. So sorry, it's what are we now?
Well,
2026.
a few more QEDs down the line, I think.
Yeah, yeah. There has been some shifting in that date. So I know originally it was more the middle of this year, but I'm pretty sure it's now much more towards the end of this year, if not next year.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, obviously that will provide quite a large link between directly between South Australia and New South Wales, which helps because South Australia does tend to have, well, I mean, its solar is obviously highly constrained, and it also, what we can see, tends to have its peak period a little bit later in the day as well. So that's it's good to have that differential between the other regions to help. Yeah.
Yep. A number of questions on batteries and FCAS.
Mhm.
Um, can you elaborate on the total revenue earned by batteries? Um, is it
Yeah.
right to assume that revenue increased for the market as a whole, but revenue per battery may have dropped due to a number of new batteries coming in?
Yeah, that's correct. So the chart on the right here, hopefully you can see it's got the average discharge and the spread. So the spread is the dollars per megawatt hour on average earned by all the batteries. So that did decrease, was down a bit over half to 104. So yeah, as we've had all this new battery come in, but the overall revenue didn't really change a lot. So yeah, the share per battery has dropped, with it being a not very volatile quarter. Yeah, the batteries, when you
Yeah.
don't have those high prices, the difference between their charging price and their discharging price isn't as big.
On the directions, is there a reason why the batteries in South Australia are asked not to charge rather than other batteries elsewhere?
Oh, that's just because we only had the minimum system load events in South Australia. So we had a few forecast MSL2s, which is the level that is required before we need to intervene in Victoria, but they were cancelled before the day they actually happened. Whereas we did have active actual MSL2 conditions in South Australia. It's got the most amount of rooftop PV per, like it's got the lowest amount. You saw it went to negative 263. So yeah, it's the region that hits those real lows that did require intervention this quarter.
Great. All right, I'm just having a look through what we haven't really addressed yet. Um, Questions on negative prices. Prices went highly negative on the last week of the year with numerous low load warnings. How close is the grid to having instability due to low demand?
Yeah, I mean that is why we have this MSL or minimum system load framework.
Yeah.
And we could see that we did need to use it on the 25th and the 26th of December, and the minimum system loads did occur in that period. So we didn't. So the MSL2 is when we take action such as directions to be prepared if there is a further reduction in load, so like a load falling off or just a sudden a further drop in load. We didn't ever hit the MSL3 level, which is when the next stage of actions need to occur, which is more things like the backstop mechanism around rooftop PV, but we didn't reach those levels.
All right. And a similar question, is this trend going to continue?
Look, yeah, I mean, we do forecast to continue. I think we put out our transition plan for system security in late December last year that does forecast when each region is expected to need to have active minimum system load management in place. So yeah, it is. I think both South Australia and Victoria. Well, South Australia we already have, and Victoria we didn't this quarter four, but we could have, and I think we're forecasting similar things to happen in Queensland and New South Wales in the next few years.
As a follow-up question regarding the MSL2 in South Australia, what was the gap that would have required an MSL3 to be dispatched?
Oh, how far were we from the MSL3? I'm
I
not
think
sure
so.
off the top of my head, but I think we had a bit. Like I definitely there was enough in the directed battery that
Yeah.
yeah, we didn't need to. The battery didn't need to discharge, right? So we just had it there ready. It didn't actually need to discharge, so we did have that
Yeah.
headroom before we even got to that point. Yeah.
All right. And maybe last question that's here. Can you recap the underlying reasons for curtailment of wind and solar this quarter, and how does this look moving forward? So we had some economic curtailment, congestion curtailment as well.
Look, congestion curtailment was actually very similar to the year before. So we had these numbers here. I'm not sure if you can see the chart where it comes up with the
Yep.
offloading and the negative curtailment. So we did have more network curtailment of grid scale solar across the NEM, but the wind didn't change year on year. So it was really that growth in the offloading, which is really driven by just the growth in capacity of the wind and the grid scale solar competing with the rooftop PV causing low operational demand, and then you've got your coal units running at the minimum stable levels, causing those really low negative prices. We did have record negative prices. So there's sort of primary drivers, and then we also had those sort of limitations on being able to share the energy across the NEM. So we weren't able to export as much into Tasmania as we have done in previous quarters. And it was also quite difficult to get it out of South Australia at times in those periods when it had really low prices.
Yeah. Well, great. I think we've addressed just about all the questions there. So thanks again, Kerry. Another very interesting quarter, and
Yeah.
we'll see you in a few months' time for another one, I'm sure.
Thanks, Dominic. Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us. Stay tuned for the next event. Thank you, Dominic, and thank you, Kerry. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.